Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 37, The Rise of Browser Identity APIs, with the guest Sam Goto, Senior Staff Software Engineer for Google Chrome. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Maybe before we dive in, you could just say a couple of words about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess born and raised Brazilian, living in California for the last 16 years or so. Have been working at Google for a long time, almost 16 or 17 years now, and always on the web. So if you think about and it's almost like a three-part story. I've done about a third of my career at Google has been in developing web apps. So I worked on Oracle.com, Gmail.com, GoogleDocs.com, GoogleReader.com briefly. And so for about a third of my life, I did web apps. At that point, in that part of the third of my life, I was a tech lead for Google, signing with Google at some point. And then spent another third of my life at Google crawling the web in Google search, which is when I started doing a lot of the semantic web stuff. So a lot of the schema.org markup, the taxonomies, ontologies, and knowledge graphs, and so on. And then for the last third of my life in Google, the last 7 years or so, I've figured that if I'm into the web, I might as well just help the web at the browser level. And so for the last 7 years or so, I've been working on the Google Chrome team, trying to extend the web in whichever ways I can be of service.
That's amazing, and we could probably have a whole nother episode just about what it's been like to work at a place as innovative as Google. But today we're going to talk about browser APIs, and actually in the homework you proposed 5 sort of related specs for different ways that the browser might interact with a person around identity. I wanted to start with a new W3C working group, I guess. I don't know what to call it, called FedCM. And I guess it starts to think about the question, if third-party cookies were to go away, what would be the impact on that? Or how could we design a system maybe without third-party cookies where identity is sort of purpose-built into the browser instead of sort of backwards, hacked sort of into like, how can we use cookies to do this? So I guess my first question to you is maybe Identirati get nervous when we talk about getting rid of like third-party cookies. What would actually be the impact on federated identity? Because I think with the exception of OpenID front channel logouts, most of these identity cookies are first party anyway. But maybe you can give us some thoughts on like what was the impetus for FedCM and how does it intersect with third-party cookie worries?
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to impetus and the rationale, I think FedCM is just one out of the dozen billion times that we've tried this exercise before. So before FedCM, most notably, there were things like Mozilla Personas, obviously. There was Microsoft Info Cards. There were OpenYOLO and AccountChooser.org. And so I think that this overall desire to figure out what the identity layer in the browser would be is something that precedes FedCM, but at least a couple decades. And then
I haven't heard OpenYOLO in so long. Thank you. I had forgotten that was even a thing.
and largely, to some extent, a lot of the actual product manager that was my partner when we kind of got together in Chrome was actually one of the people helping designing OpenYOLO. I think Eric Sachs? That was Steve Sonef and Eric Sef were the ones building some of this in the identity org at Google. And then Steven joined Chrome and then partnered with me to look at these things. And so much of the intuition of FedCM, I think, comes from all these past efforts. And then third-party cookies, you ask about the intersection between where it comes from and also where, how it intersects with third-party cookies. I think third-party cookies was just an opportunity something that was adjacent to where we were that felt like it would be worth revisiting this broader agenda, this broader vision of thinking of ways in which the browser can help with identity flows.
Maybe I could show a quick, I'm going to try and do the screen sharing. Let's see how it goes. This is a diagram from, let's see if we can get our faces in here. No. Sorry, I'm experimenting. We'll go with this one. So this is you wrote up a blog about FedCM a while back, and you provided this diagram about how if you were going to build identity into the browser, you might do it differently today. Can you talk a little bit about like what that interface would look like and how that would maybe be better than what we're doing today?
Yeah. So first and foremost, right, the thing that I think stands out in this diagram is that there's, for the first time, a entity in the middle, right? You have the user agent in the middle, kind of like intermediating, participating actively between the relying party and the identity provider, right? And so, and I guess you could say that that's already the case in terms of all the SAML flows and OpenID Connect flows, they work with the browser. But there's browser vendors at least make a distinction between low-level APIs and high-level APIs. And so if you think about cookies and third-party cookies and iframes and tuple-level redirects, that's what a browser vendor engineer would call a low-level API, meaning that these are things that are general purpose. They weren't designed to allow identity flows to happen. They just, because they can be applied to, but they weren't purposely built for that. And so, so far, identity flows have been built on top of these low-level primitives. And I think what's novel, I think, about FedCM is that it introduces a deliberate and high-level entity in the middle, the user agent, the browser, right? That then at a high level and in an identity-specific way orchestrates and mediates between the relying party and the identity provider. And in doing so, gives abilities to that exchange and to that flow that just wouldn't be otherwise available with general purpose primitives. And so that's the overall premise, is the introduction of the yellow box. But then also not only the introduction of the yellow box, but also the introduction of a yellow box that is purpose specific. So if you look at the APIs that are exposed for both relying parties and identity providers, like the signing API, sign out, revocation API, as well as the identity provider, you're having concepts like accounts API, metadata, and token API. These are all like purpose specific APIs between these two different parties, which is what's different from the status quo of tuple-level redirects and cookies.
So the idea is that we might not have to bother the client developers with things like, okay, here you redirect and here you get the code and trade for tokens and make sure you make sure the state is the same and all those other hygiene validations that we're putting onto the client developer. And I'd just like to make one other observation here, is that I think the user agent was in our view, but it was sort of on the other side. It was here on the left side. It was like, I have a browser that's calling an RP and that RP is connected. So it was like, it's almost like you just changed the position. You shifted it as from sort of like this thing that was just like helping the user to this thing that's actually actively involved in this process.
Yeah, you're right. Like I said to you, the browser was always involved in the sense that these flows were assuming that the browser operated in a specific way, but to a large extent they were just it was a very passive involvement, right? It was just using the browser as a dump pipe, perhaps more so than an entity that was actively involved.
Right. So okay. Now you had talked about three different, when I have been promoting this episode and talking to people about it, I've mentioned that there seems to be some overlap between between different identity APIs For example, passkeys, um, the presentation of verifiable credentials, federated identity, they all seem to be doing things in the browser in a similar way. Um, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what you actually proposed. Two other in the homework, you also proposed DBSC, device-bound session credentials, and another one called WebOTP. But how are these things related? Like, or why are they just by chance coming up at the same time?
Well, I guess the one way to think about the way they're related is that these are all web platform browser APIs that just give access to things that just couldn't be available elsewhere. Like you cannot, we call this polyfilling. You cannot, there's not enough JavaScript that you can write that makes you expose access to wallets or password managers the same way that WebAuthn does, or the same way that digital credentials APIs does, or the same way that WebOTP does. So like if you think from an operating system layering perspective, right? Like think of Linux, right? Like a Linux application just can't access the file system in a way that breaks kind of like the user ACLs will run on, right? And so the operating system is operating at a layer, like at a ring 0 layer that just has access to the hardware underneath in the way that the application layer just doesn't. There's no amount of system calls that you can make in a Linux app that will give you access that an operating system running at ring 0 does. And so the same way for web apps, there's just no amount of JavaScript that one can write, no amount of top-level redirects that one can do that would give an identity protocol access to the same hardware underlying system that a browser can, right? And so like passkeys is a good example, right? Passkeys is largely, it was initially, at least has been evolving, but initially it gave access to the GNUBI, the device keys, right, the FIDO keys, and there's just no amount of JavaScript that one can write to get access to FIDO keys that are like a USB key, right? Because obviously JavaScript web apps don't have access to USB keys. There you go. Yeah. There were I have many of prior times. The USB-C keys are. Yeah, I remember when these started, and it was an introduction to something that could fundamentally change how secure the system was, right? In the same way, so device-bound session keys, which is another thing that I mentioned to you, of which I'm not actually the main proponent, and so I would just I apologize if I misrepresented it, but in my mind, it gives access to the TPM, the hardware protected storage, right? Key store, right? Which there's just no amount of JavaScript that you can write to get access to that hardware device key, right? And in doing so, allows cookie theft to be a lot less likely because you can expire them more quickly and maintain like a long-lived token in a hardware protected device, right? And so in the same way for both FedCM and the digital credentials API and the WebOTP API giving access to SMS messages, the premise I think is that these are APIs that just allow us to do as an industry things that just couldn't be done otherwise.
I was contemplating this one question. I wasn't sure if it's too existential for this conversation, but is the browser a type of operating system?
Oh, absolutely. I think the analogy is perfect, right? If you think of tabs as processes, right, and you have, the philosopher's dining philosopher's problem of having shared resources like the CPU, the memory, and the access to hardware, right? And so and then you have programming languages and Turing complete programming languages like WebAssembly and JavaScript, but then you have access to devices like the Web USB API, Web Bluetooth API, and so I think from a browser engineer perspective, I certainly feel, and for the most part, I think most people do too, feel that the browser is a platform, right? It doesn't make sense in and on itself. It just exists if people build apps on top of it.
And actually, I was joking about the WebOTP because I see OTP as like I don't quite see the advantage of like, okay, I understand if I have a device and I get an OTP. If I need that built into my browser, why isn't that just my password manager or my FIDO? I just don't understand the whole thing. But going back to the operating system analogy, um, not only are there tabs, but the browsers have plugins, and those plugins are also really powerful. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering why something like WebOTP would be built into the browser API and not just built in as a plugin.
Well, distribution, right? Like if you think about the analogy to Linux, right?
Uh-huh.
It's the distinction between being in mainline and kernel module, right? Like you can have many plugins to the kernel, but like if you're in mainline, you're in mainline, right? Like in terms of distribution, right? And market penetration is just
Okay.
a whole different level, right? And that changes the economics of the addressable market for identity protocols, right? Like
Huh.
if you assume that everybody has the ability to do passkeys, then it really does change how websites operate in their ability to depend on it. Whereas if you depend on a plugin, which has much less market penetration because it requires users to opt in, it really does change your ability to people often joke that the devil's in the defaults, and that's the difference between them. It's that a browser API, a web platform API, is something that by default is available and ideally interoperably across all the browser vendors, whereas extensions are default opt out. You have to opt into them.
Right. Good point. Um, a lot of these identity technologies come down to control of private keys.
Mm-hmm.
um, and, even crypto wallets, which run in the browser. What we're talking about here is really the ability to have a control of a private key to do something. And I wonder if, so this is where I see the overlap with verifiable credentials and wallets and passkeys.
Mm-hmm.
Our passkeys, it seems like the rubber meets the road for a longer period of time where people are actually using them and trying them out and doing real things with them. Whereas wallet seems to be very aspirational at this time. Um, but I wonder if there are any lessons. But then on the other hand, I think about crypto wallets and all of the crypto wallet theft. I mean, who's had a trial of by fire more serious than crypto wallets on the other side of the equation? But I'm just curious from your perspective and the identity layer, is the browser's access to private key, is that really the important thing here? And should we actually maybe merge these things? Because why do we need two ways to manage our private keys?
Yeah, I mean that's a one of the many $1 million questions. There are many $1 million questions. This is one of them, and it's one that I feel to a large extent, me personally, but browsers generally more broadly, I feel like we don't have a say on this in the sense of an imposition. But much of the answer to that question, I think, will be answered in conjunction with people deploying applications and having to satisfy the users. And so we don't it's not clear to me yet what the relationship is between passkeys and digital credentials, the wallet-based credentials. Much like it's yet to be seen what the role is of federation in a world of passkeys. So many of these things are moving parts, and browser vendors don't control the entirety of the moving parts. So the answer to that question is my personal answer to that question is that I don't know what the answer is, but I'm excited and I see that there's a big intersection between passkeys and digital credentials.
Um, in the passkey world, we've sort of distinguished between device-bound keys and shared keys, and there's now this thing called passkey providers, where I can store my passkeys in one of the platforms like Google, Apple, Microsoft, or maybe a platform provider like 1Password.
Yeah.
And in the wallet space, and that kind of forms the core of the trust model. I understand when I get an assertion what type of private key this is and how it's managed.
Yeah.
So one of my questions about verifiable credentials is and wallets is do they provide a similar sort of assertion trail about what type of how the key behind this thing is managed? And
Yeah.
I guess I'm not a wallet expert, and I don't know if you are either, but I'm wondering. I saw that the wallet post that you gave was actually for Chrome specifically. It wasn't W3C. But do you have any thoughts about sort of how the private key management is fleshing out in the wallet world?
Yeah, well, so I am the co-editor of the Digital Credentials API that's been developed in the W3C
Hmm.
YCG Digital Credentials community group in conjunction with both Safari and Firefox. And so what we're developing is something that we're hoping would be interoperable with both Safari and Firefox. Safari is much farther in its investment than Firefox is. And also in conjunction with the operating system layers. So iOS engineers and Android engineers, as well as Windows engineers, are somewhat involved in that community group. Um, and so I guess the question about how to manage public and private keys in the you also mentioned device bound versus shared keys, but digital credentials to a large extent has been anchored on, like, even from a sequencing perspective, right? It has been developed largely as a result of the digitalization of government issued IDs. So if you look at Europe and a lot of regulation that's coming out of Europe, their citizens are starting to get their citizen IDs more and more digitalized with things like passports and driver's license and so on, as well as in the US. Like, I live in California, I have my driver's license in my wallet, and has been and those have like extremely sensitive properties, right? These are your real name, your real identity. And so, like, as far as like the security and the privacy aspects of them, they have a really high bar, right? Like, if you can prove that you're over 18 to buy alcohol, for example, online, then we really want to make sure that that's done in a very secure way, right? So for the most part, these are device bound. They are issued to a specific wallet in a specific device, and then they get bound by like a key that's only available in that device, so that it cannot be replayed, right, or reused. Because otherwise, every teenager would have a driver's license shared across other people's wallets, right? And so, to a large extent, I think we're gonna get
Or
out
even
of the
their own. So if I have, let's say, an iWatch and an iPhone, and maybe I would expect my credentials to show up on my iWatch too. It's my device, but that's
yeah,
a different device
yeah,
with a different key maybe. So maybe in passkey world, this is solved by synced passkeys because they
yeah,
push your credentials. When I load up a new browser, I
yeah,
expect my passwords to be there.
yeah,
Wouldn't I
yeah.
expect my verifiable credentials to be there too?
Very much so, yeah. And to a large extent, that's already what's the plan is and what's been developed. We're taking the hybrid uh, uh, layer of passkeys that allows you to sync them across devices, or to have them propagated across devices, and reusing them for digital credentials. We demoed that at the last IAW with actually something that works across even ecosystems, because we're reusing a lot of the passkey stuff, right? Then, like, even if you have an Apple, if you're using Safari but you have your credentials on Android, then you should be able
Hmm.
to gather the credentials from Safari to Android, much like you should be able to do that with passkeys.
Yeah, my best post of the year in terms of impressions was a picture I took at IAW of the cross-device presentation of credentials. I guess using an Android phone and a
Yeah,
Windows. I can't. I think it was a Windows laptop with an Android phone and an iPhone.
yeah,
Um, and um, eh, I guess that's that's part of the same problem though, or that's cross vendor is what makes it different. It's not only that it's a Chrome
Yeah,
device running on Android versus running on my laptop, but it's
yeah,
actually a different device entirely. So, uh,
yeah.
any thoughts though on and the mechanism for that was scanning a QR code, and I heard some complaints about QR code scanning. Do you have any thoughts about that? Is the QR Microsoft old Microsoft research says that the point at which people need to scan a QR code, you get like 50% drop off.
Yeah.
Is this the only way we can get to do cross device? Is there any other way?
Oh, I'll grant very quickly that QR codes suck in many ways, right? It's not ideal. I don't actually work directly in that part of the layer, so I can't speak for the
Yeah,
plans, but I'm pretty confident that if it feels like that will get better over time, right? Like it feels like we will build systems that allows us to have these things without the QR codes in a more seamless way. And it feels like a solvable problem to me, and that there's enough usage of passkeys and digital credentials perhaps in the future that will just have the market push us to solve those problems in a better way, right? And so like I know that um Adam always complains about Bluetooth. Yeah, indeed, yes, as Tim brings up, it's only required once to link the device. But like
I just
I
hope that the radio comes on when I get in my car. Like I never know if it actually
yeah,
will, but so I'm with
yeah.
Adam.
Bluetooth has been hard, right? I mean, so what one of the things that worries me is like printers is the other computer science problem that have never been solved. Like I feel like printers are scrappy as they were 20 years ago, and it doesn't seem to have gone better. But the specific problem I do feel will get better over time, and if you just let it roll out and mature, it will get better over time.
So I'm curious. You said that private key management is one of the $1 million questions. There must have been another $1 million question. What was that other $1 million question in the back of your mind?
There's just too many to count, right? It's hard to enumerate them, but I guess um, I can tell you the ones that I struggle with at least, perhaps, and
Sure.
meaning that the things that I do struggle with is because I work in so many of these APIs on a daily basis. A lot of them start having intersection, and so it's yet to be seen what the relationship is between FedCM and passkeys. Some of the best formulations that I heard so far has been to make a separation between account creation and sign in, or sign up and sign
Mm.
in. So the best formulation that I heard so far actually was the first time that I heard it was from Dirk Bolfans, who works on WebAuthn. Which is matches my intuition and points me towards a specific direction, is to think of FedCM as a thing that you use once and only once for account creation or account recovery, but then you very quickly exchange that for a passkey, and then you use passkeys on a daily basis. And so you ideally would use FedCM just once in your life per app, and you would you transition very quickly to passkeys. That's yet to be seen if much like I was telling you, like it's yet to be seen if websites kind of like share that intuition, and that it's only something that we'll be able to see as websites make choices, right? Um,
Mm.
I often tell people that the analogy is the distinction between, like, when you become an employee, you present to your employer, you say like, here's my passport, and I want to create an LDAP and username, and then you just prove your passport once, but then after you present your passport, then you exchange that passport very quickly to a badge, right? So in that analogy, the FATCM is the passport presenter that you just use once you create an account with your employee, with your employer, but then very quickly that gets exchanged to something that's a lot easier to carry, which is your passkeys. So that's one of
Yeah.
the questions that I don't know what the answer is, and largely it's not one that I get to answer by myself. But the other one is also what the relationship is between digital credentials and WebAuthn too. That comes up often too.
Yeah. Yeah. Somehow I don't see the sort of, to me, the FedCM is about like an account at a domain. And at that account at the domain, you might be able to use passkeys to assert your identity. I don't see, one thing I wonder about, I see that the FedCM has a revoke API.
Yeah,
So I guess you want to say, I want to be forgotten, or please unregister me. I want to get off Facebook. Is that the
disconnected.
idea
Yeah,
with the revoke? Um,
that's correct. Yeah.
Eve Miller had a really interesting point about revoke. She's like, I don't want revoke. I want recursive revoke, so I can revoke from Facebook, but then they can revoke from all the people that they shared my data with. So like the whole web. I don't know. Good. It sounds like a very good goal. But what about, one of the other problems that has been really plaguing the identity ecosystem for a long time is logout.
Yeah.
Login turns out to be easier than logout for some reason.
Yeah.
This is where third-party cookies perhaps comes in, because in the OpenID front channel logout spec, they say you render a whole lot of iframes for each domain of each RP. So it's like a whole bunch of, and allow those like RPs to set to, clear their cookies basically. So you're doing cookie events. You're basically doing a whole bunch of third-party cookie events at once. But how would FedCM actually maybe help, or maybe it wouldn't, but does it have anything to do here with the logout challenge?
Oh, very much so. Very, very much so. Like, I guess, so we can talk more broadly about third-party cookies, but more specific about logout. Like when we ran into the logout design, it was like, wow, did these people have to work around the browser, finding really interesting tricks? Yeah, if you again, like I said, I do feel like the browser is an operating system, right? But if from an operating system level perspective, and you look at applications that are using your system calls, you go like, they were very creative, and I'm actually surprised that we managed to go this far without any help from the browser, right? But yes, like it's a bit insane in the sense that it's it relies on third-party cookies. It relies on iframes, which were never designed to be something that you use to hit an endpoint, right? Because iframes were designed to show a content area, right? To show HTML.
It wasn't
right?
the first solution, believe it or not. There was a previous solution there, but it didn't work. There was a JavaScript solution that didn't work because the JavaScript page, the page itself might be closed and the JavaScript might never run.
Yeah.
And then I think it was a fallback solution to go to iframes sometime later.
Yeah. And then there's the back channel logout too, right? And I get it, as I'm writing a browser, I don't assume that I can change TCP/IP, or then I don't assume that I can change, the Linux kernel, or I don't assume that I can change the Windows kernel. Like I'm at a layer 2, and I understand how, if you're in a layer, you partially assume that the layer under you is immutable, right? But,
yeah.
But these things are designed by people like ourselves, right? These are engineers and product managers working at companies that you can engage with, right? So, and I know that from an agency perspective, from a adjacency perspective, right? Sometimes you're in a rush and you want to get things out, and you have to, do with what you have, right? But if you allow yourself to change the underlying layer, then it might allow you to do things that you couldn't otherwise. And so for front channel logout specifically, FedCM specifically has the ability to hit these endpoints in a way that just couldn't be done before, right? So for one, it allows you to hit these endpoints without with third-party cookies blocked, right? Which these endpoints wouldn't be able to be hit when they are with third-party cookies blocked. Because it required the user session in it, right? But also, in addition to being able to hit in a credential fetch, they also allow us to do retries better, right? Like if you call these things, and like iframes are unreliable because they are not intended to be used for an API call, right? They're intended to be used as a widget that you show.
Yeah, if the call fails, there's no way to replay it. Yes.
Yeah, and not only replay, right, but do it so that is what's it called?
Auditable?
Asynchronously to the lifetime of the tab,
Sure.
right?
Yes.
So like if you hit the front channel logout and you open a lot of iframes and close the tab before some of these requests are
Yeah.
made or resolved or retried, right? Then you didn't log out to a lot of these systems, right? Whereas because FedCM is in a different layer, that is at the browser layer, it can maintain these requests even after the user goes out and changes and closes the tab or not, because
Yeah.
it is at the scheduling layer.
I always said that a logout's an asynchronous problem they try to solve synchronously, and then it
Yeah.
never works for that reason. Um,
I
but
don't. It's yet to be seen if FedCM is actually a better tool to solve this problem than iframes and whatnot. I'm saying that I'm not suggesting that FedCM necessarily is a better tool. I'm just saying that it's different. It has properties that just
or it's
weren't
purpose
present.
built to maybe
Yeah.
solve this problem, as opposed
Yeah.
to being like rigged in the back. But but this request for logout comes from the IDP to the browser, and I'm wondering how does that happen actually? Because I see the RP interface to the browser, but how does that message go back to the browser from the IDP? Would we need a new OpenID logout spec, or how would it actually work?
So we do expose a browser API that the IDP can call. And so there's one API that there are a set of APIs that RPs can call. There's a set of APIs that IDPs get to call in FedCM, in the context of FedCM, like the login status API is another example. But there is one API that call we removed it from the that's what we had initially, and it wasn't really being used. But initially we had something like identity provider logout RPs that you would pass a list of endpoints, and that the browser would then start trying to have these requests made until they get resolved.
Interesting. And Aaron Parecki was on this live stream a couple months back, and we talked about global token revocation and OAuth's token status lists. So sometimes maybe it's not just a logout event, but maybe certain tokens need to be expired. Would you see?
Yeah.
There's also been some interest in CAPE, other types of like account takeover type. Would you see potentially the FedCM being used for other types of events?
I very
like
much so.
revocation?
Yeah, I don't quite know enough about the space, but it's a layer of the system that can do things that couldn't be done otherwise, especially in signaling and especially across domains. I think across sites, I think it's something that also benefits from that layer. So it's there to help in as much as it maintains the privacy and security properties that browsers want to have. It's there to help. I wanted to. There's something that I took a mental note, but I forgot to say when you asked about front channel logout and how we would think about the OpenID spec. And the intuition so far that I have, and I don't know if it's necessarily, this is something that's evolving, so we'll have to wait and see how it evolves. But
IAWs in the fall.
Yeah, it's been a topic of many IAWs in the past, but some things need to mature before they can actually settle. But since the conception of FedCM, I've always thought that FedCM was operating at a layer that was lower than OpenID and SAML. It was competing with third-party cookies and iframes and top-level redirects. It was not competing with neither OpenID nor SAML. And so, like, as far as I'm concerned, no one should know about FedCM but editors of OAuth and SAML. In the sense that it's not the thing that people use, it's the thing that OAuth. It's not the thing that the developers use. It's the thing that OAuth editors use. Meaning that somewhere in the OpenID spec, I'm hoping what I'm working hard to is that somewhere in the future we'll have in the OpenID spec they will say, for front channel logout, for example, they'll say, oh, you can if you have as opposed to opening a bunch of iframes to the front channel logout, if you have if your app is running in a browser that supports FedCM, then call this JavaScript API instead. So meaning that it competes with iframes and third-party cookies as a binding to OpenID, right? It's the it's the binding, it's the mechanism that materializes OpenID, but it's not in competition or in opposition
Right.
to.
Well, there's 4 logout specs, so I think everyone would be fine with adding a 5th one that actually works. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, and what about the state of FedCM? What's the process look like? I saw that someone else at Google is now leading that.
Yeah.
And does Chrome support it, or will Chrome support it at some point?
There's much to be excited about the state of FedCM. I think I probably think longer term than the average person. And so, like in web platform, yeah, like you can tell a lot what kind of books someone reads based on how they use the term long term. But like I think in terms of decades, like in terms of 10, 20 years, more so than 1 or 2 years. And so that's so that you get a sense of my attention span. But there's much to be excited about where FedCM is today, in the sense that we just recently formed the FedID working group at the WTC, which is the kind of like the first step towards taking FedCM to a standards track. So something that is a community group can't really produce standards, and so we started to form that in the WTC and started to have like more rigorous process for having FedCM be a shared have shared ownership across multiple stakeholders. And so it is the case that it's currently only exposed in Chrome. Chrome stable. It's being used in production by a massive amount of websites in the orders of tens of thousands of websites, and it's millions of users are using it. If anything, it is the Google signing team is one of the most prominent IDPs with a migration that started to happen a long time ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and is intended to end somewhere this year or next year. As you can imagine, migrations are hard, but it is something that is available in Chrome stable. Firefox is probably the second browser that is the closest to exposing it as an independent implementation. Obviously, all the Chromium, some of the Chromium-based browsers already expose it, and so like Edge exposes it, and a lot of the other Chromium-based browsers. Brave, I think, is working on a variation of the UI and intends to expose it too, I believe. So after that, Firefox is also has been working with us since the start. Much of FedCM was largely inspired by Mozilla personas, and so like we get along very quickly in terms of like much of the kind of like the beginnings of FedCM were inspired by personas. And so Firefox has been contributing with a lot of great ideas on how to make it better, more private, more safe, and easier to use, and we've been working with them. Safari is the one that is a little more behind in that support.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was reading a note. So Tim was chiming in about QR codes. I see Tim Capelli's in the audience. He says the QR code's only required once. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I know people are always have an opinion about QR codes. Is not the best. So FedCM, long term, other browser vendors looking to support it, but yeah, it does take a while for them to build these things in. I remember FIDO support in Firefox took a really long time.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know where that is today, even to be honest.
I mean, I personally feel that that's actually the beauty of the web, right? It's I think it's beautiful that we have a system that many different stakeholders control, and they push towards it, like in coordination as opposed to as an imposition, right? And so I just love the fact that Firefox gets to come up with better ideas than Chrome can, and have us collaborate and work towards a better means. It takes longer, but I think it leads to a better system, I think.
Yeah, I interviewed the founder of WordPress, and he just said that it takes us longer to do WordPress as open source than if we just made decisions about we should go this direction or that direction. but we end up getting a better product at the end because we go through that collaborative open source process. On your other point about timeframes, I have to say, I'm also wonder if these features that we're working on will be used by our kids or our grandkids, and that the time frame for the adoption of identity, like technology, tends to be long, even uncontentious protocols or changes like SAML to OpenID, basically XML to JSON, not contentious, but still took, I think the OpenID came out in 2014. We're still not seeing universal adoption of OpenID. Lots of SAML out there, but oh man, we're over on time. So I guess I'll give you final thoughts on before we break. Wrong one. We want you.
Sure. So first and foremost, thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun talking to you, and I hope that this helps your audience have a sense of browser engineering. I feel like I feel for a long time, I feel like I'm the weird one at these identity conferences, or at least I was one of the first browser engineers to come up and say, "Hey, can I help?" So one more time, you're likely. I hope that I've exposed you a little bit to browser engineering, and that it's done by people just like yourself, and that just to raise my hand and say we're here to help. And we, in as much as you're interested in participating in this process, I'd love to come. So come to the WTC, come to the YCG, come to the FedID working group, the digital credentials community group, and to the web authentication working group, and participate and change. Assume that a layer under you is done by people that are quite like you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam, for coming on the show. I wanted to shine a little bit more light on FedCM because the idea of a purpose-built identity layer in the browser was really revolutionary to me when I read it the first time, and I felt like not enough people were aware of it out there. And the browser has this huge, almost oversized, impact on our identity infrastructure. The web is still really important. And I do think the browser sometimes gets a little bit forgotten about that, or taken for granted sometimes. But actually, like you guys, I think have so much impact on what you're doing. It's really incredible, and you're doing a great job and engaging with the community. So I really appreciate all the hard work. And takes a lot of years to be able to present it all as simply as you do. Just logistically, next episode on passwords. We're still talking about this in identity land. So we're going to have a good conversation about passwords next Tuesday. Please follow the show on LinkedIn. We're trying to get to 1,000 follows on the Identity Office Hours LinkedIn page. So thank you, audience, for joining in. Thank you, Sam, one more time. And we'll see you all next Tuesday.